Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 3, Episode 2 of Energy versus Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham, and I'm joined by my webinar co-hosts, Sara Hastings-Simon and David Keith. Is it just me, or are the reports of coal's death greatly exaggerated? I mean, you take the price for Newcastle coal, which is a benchmark for thermal coal, it's 4 times what it was 6 months ago. China has told its energy companies to go on a shopping spree for coal supplies before winter sets in, regardless of the cost, and has told its coal mining companies in Inner Mongolia to get cracking on production, on increasing production. At the same time, and as we talked about in our last show, China has pledged to stop financing new coal plants abroad and China's building gigawatt-sized combined solar storage electricity plants. Closer to home here, we have a federal government that has promised to ban thermal coal exports, and the Alberta government is reconsidering opening up the Rockies to more coal mining. So what is the future for coal? What is that future in China? What is that future in Canada and the world more broadly? So we have today a very qualified guest to answer that question about the future of coal. Dr. Edward Cunningham is a China specialist in energy and environmental markets, technology, and policy. He directs the Ash Center China programs and the Asia Energy and Sustainability Initiative at Harvard Kennedy School, where he's also an adjunct lecturer. And he also advises companies in the energy, environmental, and financial services sectors. So welcome, Edward Cunningham.
Thank you.
So the format for the next hour, David, Sara, and I, we're going to talk news and not news to start. Then Edward is going to help us with a primer on the coal situation in China. The 4 of us will then have a discussion until 15 minutes past the hour, the next hour, wherever you are. And then after that, we'll get to your questions. And you can send your questions, as always, via the Q&A box throughout the webinar. Please don't use the raise hand function or the chat box. And our wonderful partner, Mika McFarlane, will screen for live questioners. We're recording. If you don't want to be part of recorded history, just say no if Mika asks you to post your question live, but hopefully we'll have lots who will. So let's get into news and not news. Sara, what is your piece of news, or is it not news today?
I think mine sits sort of in the middle, or to be determined. And it's the fact that in the lead up to COP, John Kerry of the United States has basically said that he's putting together the so-called First Movers Coalition, which is a group of companies that are making pledges to purchase things like green steel and green cement. And I think this is potentially news if it really comes together and they make those pledges, because I think it's actually different from a lot of net zero company pledges, which often are a little bit ambivalent. They're a little bit hard to pin down. They don't necessarily are very clear on how they're going to get there, but this is a very specific procurement pledge. And it can really help to create that market for those products. And as we talked about on a previous episode, one of the challenges with greening cement and steel is that the cost compared to not doing that for the cement is significant, but the cost of it as a total input to whatever the cement is used for is relatively small. And so if you have a group of buyers that are basically saying, look, we're going to be willing to pay more to do this, we could move the needle there. So, let's see whether, what kind of those pledges look like, how many different groups they're able to pull together, how many different companies do this, but it's definitely something to be watching.
Yeah, I just want to agree. I think it's news. I think decarbonizing the cement and steel sectors is critically important. We did talk about that last season with Thomas Cote-Blanc of RMI, and I found myself talking about it here in my hometown of Canmore, Alberta, where there's an election happening like all across municipalities in Alberta. And people are asking, well, what should we be doing? What should we be asking our municipal leaders to do? They said, well, if you really care about climate, we should care about the Lafarge plant that's just down valley from here, because that one plant is 5 times the total emissions of our little town here. And that's really what we need to focus on. That matters. A lot of what we do municipally doesn't matter. All right, David, what's yours?
Well, this was the Nobel Prize in Physics, which I think is news. It certainly in the physics and climate world. So the Nobel Prize was awarded one half of it to Klaus Hasselmann and Suki Manabe for the development of early climate models, and the other half to Giorgio Parsi for other stuff in sort of the modeling side of physics. I think there are 2 interesting things, and I'll have one little anecdote. One is that it's a big deal for the Nobel Prize Committee to kind of signal to the world in some sense that climate models deserve something like a Nobel Prize, that they're serious enough that they get it. And I can't help but imagine there's some politics and decision to award that now. Second, maybe in the physics world, I think it's really interesting to see modeling as this kind of middle world. So we often, in the early days of this, would think about physics, about theory and experiment as kind of the two domains of science. And I think modeling has sort of developed to be a third domain of science. It's really not quite like either of those. It sits in between them in some ways, but there's really a different way that you think about how these big numerical models work. They're not, you can't predict them purely from their inputs, but on the other hand, they're fundamentally models that you can just rerun the code. They're not like experiments. So I think there really is a new domain of science about how we run these big simulations of the world, if you like. And third, I'll just say as an anecdote, so the only one of those three I know at all is Suki Manabe. I first had this amazing experience spending 5 hours where it was my job to ask him hard questions about climate sensitivity in the early 90s. And what was one of the highest impact things I've ever done. And really this effort to try and understand expert judgment about the uncertainty in climate sensitivity. So I was a young postdoc and I was kind of with this mentor. It was my job to challenge Suki a little bit to ask these hard questions about how well he knew what he knew. And really in a 5-hour long interview. And he was superb and also superbly never pulled rank, was just an extraordinarily modest guy. You know, he was already a very famous person. He built the first real climate model that had moisture in it in the mid 60s, was the center of developing the GFDL model, one of the preeminent climate models in the world. But he was completely happy to answer questions as honestly and realistically as he could. I was very impressed with him. I met him a few times since. What a calm and impressive human being, about 90 years old now.
I think it makes the second energy and climate related Nobel Prize for physics. The first, of course, being the invention of the blue LED, which won the prize in 2014 and is a key component to the LEDs that have helped us save a lot of energy in many lighting situations. So,
right, to another Japanese, to Nakamura.
Yep. And it's totally a frivolous question. I asked this on the day that William Shatner at the age of 90 just blasted off into space, courtesy of Jeff Bezos. Is Suki Manabe perhaps one of the oldest Nobel laureates that we've had? Is this going to be viewed as a lifetime achievement award? Because I've not heard of an older Nobel laureate.
I think that's pretty old, but I don't know. I haven't seen him for a while, but when I saw him, he was in his last around 10 years ago. So he would have been about 80 and he was running and looked pretty damn healthy, but who knows? Anyway, next up from you.
Nice piece of news. So my piece of news is Canadian readers of the Globe and Mail will recognize the European correspondent, a guy named Eric Reguli. And he wrote a piece on October 2nd on autonomous cars called Not Coming to a Road Near You Anytime Soon, Self-Driving Cars. And it's a piece that pokes fun at admittedly overly ambitious predictions made by most of the tech companies in the last decade or the last half decade. Tech companies more so than car companies, actually, about the deployment of fully autonomous passenger vehicles. And he makes an argument for why they're not coming to a road anytime near you, anytime soon. I put this in the not news category this week because I think the hype cycle about autonomous vehicles doing all the driving when we need to go to the office or, we need to take kids to gymnastics practice was just wrong to begin with. Sharing the road with self-driving cars is just hard. It remains hard. And not because of the self-driving cars, it's because of us as irrational drivers, that we make irrational decisions. But what I think he really missed is that the real story is about incremental improvements. And any driver who's got one of those whiz-bang auto park functions can attest to this. Incremental improvements that increase efficiency, increase the driving experience, but more importantly, autonomous vehicles that reduce labor costs in like repetitive transit or in taxis or industrial activity. And on the industrial activity, I think this is where we're really seeing rapid deployment because the economics are so compelling. Take mining. Rio Tinto now has over 130 autonomous trucks running at its mine sites. BHP uses a fully autonomous fleet of trucks at one of its Western Australian facilities. And the Chinese miner, Sani, recently announced that it's deploying 2 autonomous electric mining trucks. That's the real story. That's where we'll see the rapid deployment. I agree. It's not coming to a road you and I drive on anytime soon, but it's coming to those industrial roads, and companies are reaping the benefits as a result.
And I would just add that I agree with you. I think that also it's been interesting to see how, for me at least, the next wave of electrification of vehicles actually really is commercial. And what's most interesting is that it's in many ways wireless charging and basically an ability to enable 24/7, very clear duty cycle type of vehicles that are very focused on efficiency and total cost of ownership. That is where a lot of the money and focus is currently today. So I think you're dead right to focus on that.
Thanks, Edward. All right. Well, with that concludes this week's news, not news segment. Always curious for feedback. This is a news segment. It partly came from the feedback we got from our summer survey. If you like what you heard, let us know. If you didn't like what you heard, especially let us know. Okay. Mika, let's launch poll number 1. Wonderful. So you can see the poll question there. When will global coal fall to less than 1/3 of what it is today, global coal consumption? And David, you've got a really interesting graphic that tells the coal story kind of at a glance. And I'd love for you to show that and to speak to that.
There it is. I'll quickly toss this over to Ed, but this is just shows you basically the last quarter century of coal consumption and production. So one thing you see, of course, is consumption and production are about the same, which is a sign there's not really big interregional trade in coal. And the fundamental story is that the coal consumption was sort of steady up until the beginning of this century. Then over the first 10 years of the century, first decade of the century, it went up by something of order 60%. And it's basically been flat since then. And, you could, if you're optimistic, say there's some decline, but I wouldn't say there's a clear trend of decline. What is clear is that it's really all about Asia Pacific, and the rest of the world is going down. And maybe over to you, Ed.
Yes. I mean, I would just add that these are great charts, and I often like to use the hockey stick analogy. So since you're in Canada, I think that's a particularly appropriate. And in terms of my own sort of professional life, it was quite interesting to live through this when I started my doctoral dissertation focused on China's coal industry and power industry as well, because fundamentally what this graph really shows is largely a story of China's accession to the WTO in late 2001 that then led to so much of the growth that was then powered overwhelmingly by coal, and to a lesser extent, the rise in industrialization, continued industrialization of India. And so really those two highly inefficient energy players in many ways drove the global stage for coal to the point where now China, actually since 2011, for over basically a decade, China has consumed over half of global coal.
Well, let's talk about China and talk about coal. I, by the way, just shared the poll results. So when do you, dear listener, think that global coal will fall consumption to less than 1/3 of what it is today? Most of you, close to half, think it's between 2030 to 2040.
But half overall think it's before 2040. And maybe you're right. I guess I think it's optimistic.
I do too. And we're going to get there in our discussion today of where we think coal's going. But we also need to talk about where is coal going in China, because you look at that graph and, coal is really an Asia story. And in particular, it's a China story. So we want to bring Edward in and just help him get him to help us to understand the situation better. So, I mean, Edward, like I was in China in 2014, and I remember then it was sort of the height of here in Canada where people were saying, well, Canada, we're only 2% of emissions, and China is building a coal plant once a week. That's where we need to focus efforts on. And you talked about, the growth of China being powered by coal. And that's when I heard the phrase rich in coal, short in oil and gas, when Chinese were describing the resource landscape of China's energy system. But at the same time, we know since then, China has been investing more in renewable energy than, frankly, any other country on earth, and building those gigawatt scale plants. So with that as a long rambling a preamble, tell us what is happening with coal in China today.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Ed. The one way to think about it is coal. What is coal doing within China, and then what is coal doing outside of China, but largely through Chinese banks and Chinese companies? So within China, it's quite interesting. We actually today, a lot of people might notice who are paying attention to the news, we're seeing very high coal prices, and we have something around $300 or so a ton. And that's an interesting window and start into this discussion where there's a confluence of both supply, demand, and policy design flaws that are really coming together to drive that. That what we're seeing on the supply side is an informal ban on Australian coal imports that started last year as a response to Australia's investigation of the origins of COVID-19. Other supply shocks like floods in Indonesia, closing the border with Mongolia, for example, because of the pandemic. So there was a real drop in imports, number one. Number two, there were domestically, there were mine closures that had happened that were real both as an attempt to reduce emissions and to reduce coal use, and particularly inefficient coal mines, but also in anticipation of reduced demand during COVID. There was also an anti-corruption campaign in Inner Mongolia that disrupted those supplies, for example. They raised safety fines that really mitigated a lot of these investments that were going to happen anyway. So there was a lot happening on the supply side. But on the demand side, of course, I think the CCP and also the NDRC, the sort of super planning agency, were quite surprised at the bump in rising demand globally for Chinese goods and products. So the reopening was faster than anticipated. So there was, of course, a rise in demand at the same time that there was various choke points on supply. And then lastly, what's occurring is, which I think is probably most interesting, is something that we see cyclically, so not something new, which is that those upstream, coal prices were basically deregulated many years ago in order to create such coal supply over time. But the cap on electricity is fairly narrow, meaning only if you're if you're the grid, you can only pay about a 10% increase at any given time on power. So there's a pretty hard cap on that. And so, of course, as you can imagine, with the increase in coal prices and the cap on power prices, effectively a lot of the power generators were unwilling to produce because they were losing for every kilowatt hour they're producing. So that's changed a bit. They've gone to 20%, but it's that disconnect between a still fairly unsophisticated power pricing regime and a deregulated coal pricing regime. And so we're seeing that. So that's just sort of context of a window into today, some of the challenges. If you then look at coal overall, it's still about 60% of primary energy production. So, close to 2/3. That's been difficult to push down. I know David and I have for many years talked about this. If you look at, let's say, electricity generation, how important is coal electricity generation? It's still about 2/3, close to 70% of electricity generation. A lot of people talked about the attempts to reduce that. Even in the past 10 years, let's again sticking with electricity, just in about 10 years, it's dropped about 10% from just under 80% to just under 70%. So hydros remain stable, and that gap, so that reduction in coal, has been basically filled by wind, primarily nuclear, gas, and solar. And so what does this mean? It means that, well, if you look at sort of coal, particularly power plants, and that critical use of coal, because coal really fundamentally is industrial use. Think of it as smelting, iron ore into steel. So that's the largest driver, but then electric power. What we're seeing is within China, even after accounting for plants retired, for example, in 2020, their coal-fired fleet still rose by a net 30 gigawatts, right? So that to your point about significant growth, we haven't seen the end of it. It still continues. So that 30 gigawatts is more than the cuts made by the rest of the world. Just in the first quarter of this year, for example, CO2 emissions rose about 10%, 9% above pre-pandemic levels. So that's a real challenge. You can all, did you have a question, Ed?
No, since let me jump in. When I was on that trip, I went to WWF China's offices, and they're very excited around this massive deployment of renewable electricity that we've seen. President Xi has a vision, and I know this is translated from the Mandarin, so it's a bit awkward, but new type renewables dominant power system. Is now this resurgence of coal and coal prices for all the reasons that you've talked about, and the volatilities now, the cracks that we're seeing in China's power grid system, to the point where they're talking about go out and get as much coal before the winter, prioritizing residential use over industrial use so that we don't have Chinese without power and without heat, etc. Is now not putting a major dent in Xi's vision, or is this just a little sort of bump in the road?
No, it is a major challenge. I mean, I think it's quite interesting, right? So if we sort of shift slightly to this bigger question around climate and how Xi is trying to position the country, particularly vis-a-vis the United States, if we think back just to the most recent Trump administration, I think for many of my friends, within China and certainly within the government, they admitted it was an easy leadership shift, right? Where there was a vacuum in this area, particularly clean energy and climate. And therefore for China, it was an easy way to claim leadership globally in an area that where there was vacuums. And often we do see that in other areas as well, in terms of Chinese international actions. And so there is a strategic challenge now because, of course, the Biden administration is much more aggressive on this issue, particularly climate, but also clean energy. And going into Glasgow, there's not only is there an absence of long-standing, usually a year before, at least the last COP, year before, detailed discussions that Obama had with Xi and a whole bunch of initiatives that were able to come out of that. This time there really isn't, despite John Kerry's attempts. There really is no real, certainly no long-term 1 year before level of discussion. And as a result of that, I think for Xi at this point, he's really in a tight position because the good part is he's made these commitments, like publicly and on the global stage. That was easy to do when there was no other real competitor in the space. Now that the U.S. has returned, and of course the EU to an extent, he really cannot be, on the one hand, he wants to achieve those goals. However, there's two problems. One is, as you just noted, the world has seen China's own challenges and also its actions more than its words. And the actions have very much recently been to increase coal production, increase heat production, increase power production for all the reasons we just discussed. So that certainly undercuts credibility. But the other important issue is he cannot be viewed as making these types of decisions under duress or somehow because of American and foreign influence. They have to be viewed as in the interest of the people, right? So a Chinese decision. That's also tricky now because there is so much international pressure. So that's, I think, one way to think about it.
Yep, and we'll talk a bit about the widespreading implications of COP26 being a failure, and it certainly is shaping up to being an exercise of, square parentheses and injecting commas here and there, but nothing along the lines of what we saw coming out of the Paris Agreement. But so she is not under the same pressure to make these international pronouncements, and yet he just came out a couple of weeks ago. We talked about this on our last show and did announce a twist to the Belt and Road Initiative, and that is China will not itself build new coal plants abroad, nor is it going to be financing the development of those new coal plants outside of China's borders. So, Edward, can you give us the backstory on that?
Yes, that's also quite interesting. Yeah, on the one hand, of course, if you think about coal-fired power abroad, China today is financing. It's very hard. There's Kevin Gallagher has a great project in Boston University, for example. There are different projects that are tracking different numbers, and so there's a bit of this ongoing lack of clarity to some extent. But think of it as about 200 to 250 gigawatts of new coal-fired facilities that are being currently financed by China today. So that's more than the existing American fleet of coal-fired power. So that flies in the face of the most recent pronouncement from Xi. And for example, when you look at another way to measure this, the stimulus that the Chinese government, the central government, put forward to combat economic decline as a result of COVID, right, to sort of stimulate the prime the pump, stimulate the economy, those have mostly been in fossil fuel. So about 3 times the size of any stimulus related to low carbon projects. So again, sort of actions versus words. So when we then look at the Belt and Road, BRI, and really whether those words will be backed up by action moving forward, I would say it's difficult. I would be surprised if we really can see that level of full stop, given how much already has been built and it will continue to be built. And more importantly, I would focus on a couple of key questions. And there's a lot out there that we can send after, but where people have talked about this. But one is, it's like many of these central directives, they're by design fairly vague, and they always have been, even if you go back, throughout modern Chinese history. So one is this restriction on financing coal plants. Are those related to the ones currently under development, right? So given the size, that's a big question, or is it only to future projects, or is it both, right? That's not answered. Oh, wow. Yeah. Second piece is, it's really unclear, and this is a leakage issue, and this is something where I spend a lot of my time. It's unclear whether the restriction relates to Chinese labor and hardware, for example, through third parties, right? Because you see a lot of that as well, and that's where the leakage kind of comes in, and that's another big issue. And then third is it restricted finance from private or state-owned enterprises, or is it restricted finance from development banks and agencies, for example, right? So which actors really are going to be covered? And it's always, it takes time for those vague central mandates to then filter through and be pushed back against by not only the agencies, but also often the banks themselves. And so it's not as if, simply because the general secretary of the CCP makes an announcement like that, there is no institutional response. It often is the case. And in fact, we often hear in Chinese for decades, the sort of top has measures, the bottom has countermeasures. And so, for me, the other important issue, which I try to be optimistic about, but I'm not sure. I think his name is Jake Levine. So the U.S. So it's a question about U.S. alternatives. I mean, we've really fallen flat, and the Europeans, in terms of actually providing alternatives. So it can't just simply be looking at and constantly criticizing China. I think, for example, debt trap diplomacy, debt trap financing, I think is, for most of the studies who've really looked at that, it's a red herring. It's not really true. Often what the Chinese are doing is in response to demand from the host country who wants these types of infrastructure projects. And so then that leads to a very important question, which is, what is the U.S. and what is Europe doing to provide alternative debt financing and equity financing? So just quickly, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, the DFC, has made some recent changes under Biden, right? So they have now for the first time a climate officer, a chief climate officer. I think his name is Jake Levine, and that's important. They've committed to a third of their budget to be by 2023, I think, to be spent on climate projects. That's also important. And it's not that large, from my perspective, but it's better than very little, which has been current sort of status quo. It's about $60 billion that they have. That's not that much, actually. Chinese policy banks financed about $5 billion just last year. and about 250 billion, since 2000. So our 60 billion, to be honest, is not exactly a meaningful number.
Can I interrupt a little bit? I mean, I think we get lost in the complexity, but I feel like what I'm hearing is really interesting. So you really know this stuff, and you're saying that this big splashy announcement about no more coal in Belt and Road is a lot less crisp than it appears. And
Correct.
It's really not clear if that means no new financing from some really centralized facility. It's not clear if it's just coal-fired electric power or other, coal-fired cement or steel. It's just not clear.
Right. And to your point, I mean, it's certainly not related to cement, aluminum, steel, right? That is certainly not related to this. It's really about electric power, electricity generation. Right? It's only that. And even within that, and it's those points you just mentioned. Yes.
Yeah. And Edward, if we put a question to you similar to like our poll question, except make it specific to China, I've always thought that, we need Western countries, Japan, et cetera, phased out coal completely by 2040 at the latest. But around the same time frame, we need China to have its coal fleet. And its current coal fleet, can't remember the number, but correct me if I'm wrong, it's about 1,000 gigawatts.
Mm-hmm.
When realistically, to put you on the spot, do you think China will have half of its coal fleet compared to where it is today? Like, are we talking 2040, 2050, 2060, or is it impossible to say?
Really? That's a good question. Let me answer this. So I'll attempt to answer it. If you look at a most recent science paper that was quite good, that was one of the few that really looks at China's own nationally determined contribution to climate change, greenhouse gas emissions. What it basically says is that China's coal demand would need to decline to basically zero by 2050 in order to reach our global 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, right? So in terms of what we're really trying to do, if that's the goal, we're talking about much more aggressive change that has to happen. So, 2050 is 30 years from now. So, fossil fuels in China would need to decrease by 3/4. The total primary energy consumption would have to decline by 40% in 30 years. So those are numbers that are daunting, obviously. So if you were to ask me, when will we see China's coal-fired power fleet halved from today? I guess my answer would be, I would assume, I would be surprised if it were 2040, as we certainly after 2040. And again, the reasons are largely because there's some fundamental challenges when you're trying to remove. Think of it this way, just to step up a moment. The GDP structure, right? So China's is an outlier in some sense, given its size, where 40% of its GDP is driven by industry. That is something that the government has been trying to reduce and increase services. So people who track this have constantly looked at how Xi and others have said, well, we need to become more like the U.S. It's about not just services have to go from 60 to, or really 55 to well over 70, but also the consumption-led model that the U.S. has will allow China to sort of be to determine its own destiny, right? Where it's not dependent on export-led growth and outside demand, and obviously all the problems that entails. So if you just look at that structural issue, when you have 40% that is of your GDP driven by industry, it means that in order to then increase consumption and move away from industry, a lot of other very critical things need to happen. And for example, you really need you need significant social welfare change so that people aren't concerned about, if my mother all of a sudden has a significant medical issue, I need significant cash because I don't really have adequate medical insurance to be able to spend on her. So therefore I won't spend. There's a lot of structural issues there that have historically mitigated have been obstacles to the leadership's attemptership. So you've got that issue, and therefore within industry, which is hard to decline, it's been declining, but it's still a big chunk. That's why you have not only various stimulus packages to prop it up these days, right? Not only for employment goals, but also for to meet investment goals, that creates significant lower value chain, high energy intensive needs for coal. And so that's a long answer to a short question.
Well, yeah. And the Chinese government has lots of preoccupations, including things like unfunded pension liabilities of state-owned enterprises. And the unrest comes from that, which is why they manufacture these conflicts over some atoll in the China Sea to divert attention. Anyways, I'm getting it to wag the dog here. But Sara, let's bring you in. So are the reports of coal's death greatly exaggerated? What do you think? Is this and not just specific to China, but globally, is this a dead cat bounce, or is king coal here to stay for the foreseeable future?
Oh, yeah, a lot of, I guess, a lot of thoughts on that. I mean, one thing I think is the timescales that we're talking about matter a lot, right? And so, especially when we're talking about infrastructure that is literally, steel in the ground when it comes to power generation, the dynamics of how some of these things play out over a couple of years is very different from a lot of years. And so I think that there's, is coal dead in the very near term? I think it's clearly no. I do think, though, that the response to higher prices or shortages or issues with supply of coal, there's sort of two different responses, as there is for any kind of resource. One of which is to start producing a lot more of it, and the other is to start using less of it, either by we've seen it, if you go back to the oil embargo in the U.S. in the 70s, increase in efficiency, more local production, things like that. And so I think what does cause me to say that, we are at some point in coal's real decline is that the alternatives are getting and are better and better. And, we know that already it is now cheaper in almost all cases to build new renewables than it is to run those coal plants. And that becomes more true, when the financing, even if it's not cut off completely to 100%, but you just remove the development bank financing and you're left with private sector financing, the financing costs become much higher and it becomes that much harder to build those new plants. So, I think the story where, we just flip the switch overnight and it's gone is a bit Pollyannish, but I do think that there are underlying structural elements that are going to drive that decline. That said, I think it's also important that we recognize, that the challenge that is there and what's required. And, Edward's point about it's not enough to just say, well, we shouldn't be doing this, but what comes in instead. And one, I was actually just reading through the IEA's World Energy Outlook, which came out literally a couple hours before we got on the phone, and they had an interesting stat about the age of retirement for coal plants under their net zero scenario. And on average, the age of retirement sort of required to be consistent with the net zero scenario in developed or advanced economies, I think they call it, is 40 years, whereas in emerging economies, it's 25 years. So you're basically saying you're in order to meet that net zero scenario, you're letting advanced economies get, the bulk of the lifetime and the investment out of these coal plants, whereas you're really asking emerging economies to do a very heavy lift and basically, retire and strand a lot of assets that are left there. So I mentioned that because I think that's also an important part of the conversation that comes up when we talk, here we sit in Canada and are saying we should, we don't need to do anything because those guys are building coal plants. That's a very snapshot in time versus kind of the bulk of emissions over time coming from the US and Canada and these countries here. So, certainly it's not something that we can just sit back and let it happen. But I think even in the US, right? I mean, Joel Daniel has done some interesting work that showed that, even in the Midwestern US, there was a loss of almost $500 million from 2016 to 2019 by running uneconomic coal plants in MISO. So, even when the economics are against you, there are real challenges in doing this. So it's certainly, I think, not easy, but I don't think that those challenges that we see coming up means that we aren't on what I think is clearly a long-term decline for coal.
Yeah, and to your point, Sara, the average age of a coal plant in Asia is 12 years right now.
Just exactly.
Yeah, so whether they're asking them to shutter at 25 years or 40 years, that's hard. And you and I both know from the work we did in Alberta around the Alberta Climate Leadership Plan, what it's like to try to get a big utility to shutter a coal plant before its best before date. And the answer is it's really hard. They don't want to strand the asset. And they don't want to leave all that money on the table when they
until the economics, right, come into play, right? And then that pushes it.
Yeah. So can we imagine an Asian coal plant owner shuttering prematurely? It's hard. David, what's the impact of this?
Well, the very different role of natural gas. So Sarah said renewables are cheaper. Well, renewables are cheaper when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. I think renewables are I actually was teaching class today with a dispatch model where actually my kids are running a simulation looking at this, and I was just playing with it. You can, if you have gas prices very high, you can make solar prices low, and solar totally takes the middle of the day, but the shoulder is still done with coal if the coal was bought. But I think the big difference is in North America, electricity dispatchers at marginal cost. With low gas prices, it's easy for gas to kill coal in those applications. But in China, I think what we'll see more and more renewables enter, because no question they're, lots of them are cheaper in lots of ways, but the coal capacity will be there. We won't easily have gas to displace it. And I think you'll see those coal plants running, basically, they won't be running at the bottom of the dispatch stack, they'll be running when renewables are. Yes. And that might happen for a long time in a way that's different from here because there's not cheap gas.
Yeah. And that's, I think, the other reason why I always push people to, look at the utilization rates, right? Don't look at installed capacity, which is what all the media headlines are always, plant a week, like you said, Ed. But that's obviously not the right thing to look at. The right thing to look at is how much is being generated. And of all of those plants, basically the average is now under 50% utilization, right? So there's an enormous amount of capital being thrown at something and huge amounts of steel going in the ground, to Sarah's point, but it's massively misused, so hugely inefficient, right?
Yeah. And that plant a week stat that I often heard from oil and gas executives around why should we do anything? A lot of that I understand was just taking 50s or 60s era coal plants that were located, and this surprised me when I was in China, like right in downtown cores, and try to move them outside of cities, move them to the hinterland where the thermals blew in a different direction.
So true.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's unpack this. The other thing I hear from oil and gas industry executives a lot is this idea of Canada LNG being a climate solution because we export Canadian LNG and it's going to displace Chinese coal-fired electricity. So there's, folks who say, well, that, it's a net positive and it should be included in Article 6 coming out of any COP agreement. And that's typically the industry or here the Alberta government argument. And others who say you run the numbers and it's a net negative. And that's the Ingo community and prominent scientists. What's your sense, Edward, of this idea of Canadian LNG actually displacing China coal-fired electricity?
Yeah, I mean, sir, and I defer to you guys in some sense because you're the Canada experts, but we just are starting to see American LNG, right, sent to China. So it is happening. The reality is that should be happening in terms of LNG prices are incredibly high, right? So LNG obviously is still not a global market, and the basins are quite different. And as a result, we're seeing in Asia, we have a real serious premium to LNG, which is why I think from the Chinese government perspective, there's a lot of hesitancy and part of the reason why we haven't seen gas take off the way I think a lot of people expected 10 years ago, when there was a lot of promise there. So on the one hand, there is an equalization that needs to happen in terms of pricing because it's not a global market. So that I've been as sort of with the economist part of my brain, I've been waiting for that to happen. On the other hand, and to add to that, we should see it also because I've seen a significant shift in terms of the mentality of policymakers to be very import tolerant. So when I really was a young kid starting all of this and going to China, even in high school, there was grain self-sufficiency policies, right? So the Maoist era and that approach has had ripple effects all the way through the modern period, right? So, and there's lots of examples I can give. Coal itself, actually, coal only up until fairly recently, China was the largest coal exporter, right, in the world, and then within a year and a half became China the largest importer. So that enormous shift in comfort with import tolerance for gas, for oil is real. It began in oil, it moved to gas, now it's also in coal. Also, it enables LNG imports to increase politically, but I don't personally see that there will be given how much has been put into, how much money also has been put into the coal-fired approach, and basically, like David was saying, a pretty significant push in subsidies in solar that has now been tapered, and also in wind, and now a bit in hydrogen. I'm not necessarily sure there'll be a huge jump in LNG specifically from Canada into China, because the LNG demand itself has been a bit restrained. But I'm interested in what you guys think.
Sure. And Sara, I'd love to hear it. So, but to summarize this new attitude on imports, rich in coal, short in oil and gas, so it's okay to go import oil and gas.
That's correct. Yes. And just one quick follow-up. One of the things that's fascinating to me on the security level, meaning security concerns from both the military and from the central government, one of the significant concerns as China became a net oil importer, and several years after that, which was the early 90s, there was a deep concern that there would be a significant dependency on a region, and that region was the Middle East. What I think is one of the most powerful lessons that policymakers have learned over the decades is that despite enormous, both relative and absolute numbers, growth in import from other countries in oil, the ratio and dependency on the Middle East has actually slowly gone down, meaning it's always about 50%, about half. It's actually gone down because of Russia, because of Latin America, because of African imports. And that was really through many commercial decisions of Chinese oil companies, less some sort of strategic levers and manipulation of those investments. And that gave great comfort and gives great comfort to many of the policymakers who then say, well, actually import dependence does not mean reliance on a particular region. I think that's a powerful lesson for that.
Sara, I'd love to get your thoughts on this Canadian LNG being a climate solution by displacing coal-fired electricity in China question. Would you put your hand over your heart and proclaim Canadian LNG a climate solution and eligible for Article 6 credits?
So I think on the credit part, it's very questionable, right? And why, does a product that Canada sells get counted as a credit piece? I actually, this question of is LNG helpful because it displaces coal, or is it not helpful because you end up burning more natural gas, is something that I have wondered about for a long time, and actually did some analysis with Lydia Shooting and Arvind Ravikumar. We have a paper that looks at exactly this question of sort of, if you increase LNG actually as, planned construction is even already, do you end up with more LNG that can be used to switch from coal to gas, or do you end up with more LNG that goes above what you can switch your plants essentially? And so what we found is that, interestingly, I think it depends, right? And so if you believe that we are going to manage to get to a 1.5 degree trajectory, then building out more LNG is going to be harmful post about 2030. There's still a few more years where it can contribute to reducing emissions. With a 2 degree scenario, it's about 2038 at the upper limit. And this is assuming basically you're able to actually get the majority of that net more LNG into coal plants that are switching to gas. If you believe we completely just don't manage at all and we're on a 3 degree trajectory, then LNG has a role to play in reducing emissions. Now, we're actually doing some follow-up work because, this was sort of an upper bound limit to basically say, well, just the coal plants that you have. Then importantly, when we think about the role that coal to gas switching has played in reducing emissions in Canada and Alberta, and also in whether it's directly or just going to gas-fired plants in the US, you have regions that have quite a lot of natural gas infrastructure. And so now we're actually looking at sort of the next level of that question of, without building out a whole new natural gas infrastructure, what would it take? How many coal plants, how much can you actually switch? Because once you start putting, a lot of new pipeline in the ground to actually switch these coal to gas plants, it becomes not such a very good deal anymore. And that's going to give you sort of another haircut on that on top, where, it's hard to say without having finished all that analysis. But I think where we're going to end up with is, for scenarios that we seem to be on, you don't need a lot more natural gas to have LNG or have natural gas play that role in getting off coal that it can play now. So, certainly we can use what we have, but this idea that we're going to build out a ton more and that's going to be some big part of the climate solution, I think just isn't borne out by the numbers.
Okay, let's park the LNG discussion there. Let's go to Q&A. We have Robert Tremblay, who is our questioner par excellence on energy versus climate. So over to you, Robert.
Thanks. My question is, how much impact do you think that emerging carbon tariff schemes will have on the use of met coal? Could this be a big leverage point to combat coal use in supply chains? And I guess I'm thinking kind of the EU and the US specifically on the carbon tariff front.
I will just jump in. I think the leverage on met coal is smaller because the price elasticity for steel is a lot stiffer. Steel is stiffer. So I think that if you raise carbon tariffs, however you do it, especially in a market where there's different electricity choices, especially when you do coal gas switching or coal renewable switching, then as you raise the carbon price, which is basically like raising the coal price, you can shift dispatch quite smoothly, for example, over to gas or over to maybe, China's actually building a lot of pumped hydro storage, which allows more renewables and lots of things you can do. Whereas with metallurgical coal, gotta switch to a non-metallurgical way to make steel, or you gotta drive steel demand down. And I think driving steel demand down is tough because you've got a big lever to make steel prices are pretty inelastic. Demand is pretty inelastic. And we certainly can switch to steel with different processes, but that's hard technological change.
Yeah. And I'd say, you see a bit of you see sort of electric arc furnaces that use electricity to do it in China to some extent. But the reality is most of that investment has already been made, as they put it, in a coal solution as opposed to the arc furnaces. So you can do it. It's just then you have to put a whole bunch of other capital equipment in, and as we all know, that's long cycle investments.
Yeah, it's great that, and Sara, you brought on our new news and not news segment this first movers initiative, and particularly talked about clean steel and clean cement. It's critically important, but we have to recognize how expensive it is. You want to change out these outdated blast furnaces that you have in China or in central Canada, for instance. But when I talk to steel industry executives, they say that's about $300 a ton. And so even when we get our carbon price up to $170 a ton, which we have a shot at with a reelected federal government, it's still uneconomic. They're going to close those steel plants every day at that price rather than make the technology shift. So, yep.
Yeah, I think, sorry. I need to get you off. But I actually think that it can play an important role for I guess that's the early movers, and we'll call them the like mid to late movers, where you basically, I agree that, that the early movers is really looking to be more like companies that are driven by some sort of stakeholder pressure. I would argue it would be nice if it was for once governments driving things instead of leaving everything to these private companies, but that seems to be where a lot of climate action is coming from. And so, they will move ahead, but then I do think that you have that second tranche that the process by which you build more of these, whether they're hydrogen steel plants or other processes, the cost comes down somewhat. And then that carbon price or tariff starts to then make it, kind of at least closer to par or not such a big step for that next group. And I actually think that's a dynamic that we've seen with renewable energy procurement, right? Where you had kind of the leading companies, the Apples and Microsofts of the world paying a lot of money for some of those early PPAs that you signed. And now, everybody and their brother wants in on the PPA market for renewables, partially because, frankly, it's not that much more expensive anymore, and sometimes it's even cheaper. So, I think, like always with climate policy, there's never the one policy, and so I think that this has a role to play, but I think it only starts to bite later on.
Yeah. Going back to your comment about cement, if you look at the end-use consumption, you have low carbon cement. While at the point of production, it adds a lot of costs. On the end-use side, it's only 1% of what you paid to build a house. And so that incremental increase is very, very small. We've got a question here, and Edward, to put you on the spot, I'd like to put it to you. So it's from Gary Nikiforuk. Here I found the question. Can you speak to the potential for CCUS on coal plants, particularly in Asia or more specifically in China? There's lots of discussion, lots of excitement around CCUS in North America, in the United States, with the Section 45Q, in Canada now. with an investment tax credit under design. I don't hear as much about it when talking about coal plants in China.
Right, that's correct. And I think, I mean, I believe there are 20 different CCUS projects globally. I think 11 of them, or the majority, I think, in the US. And there's only, I think, 3 or 4 currently in China. So this is something that it's been discussed for a long time. Just as and this might tickle David Spencer, given, the sort of direct air capture work he does, is when you look at, I think it's the same Science article, it does a great job, and it basically says, look, for China to meet these goals, it basically 20% of the reduction has to happen through some form of sequestration. So that sleeve or that wedge is a critical one. The reality, I think, in China is that it's not just a question of cost, which is significant, but it's also a question of a real shift in the way, ideally, having a strong central government actually is helpful, right, for CCUS, because it's any form of CCS, because in the end of the day, it's a long-term bet, and you need long-term signals and authority from a long-term player to be able to ensure that things remain on the ground and that the rights remain in place, all those types of things where I think at least the private sector does a very poor job. So in some ways, we've all felt China would be a great test case for this. The reality is that we haven't seen uptake, I think largely because not only cost, but also there's, as we usually see, there's a, I'm trying to think the best way. There is surprising levels of intolerance for technological risk, so you see this time and time and time again within different sub-industries, sub-sectors. In China, we saw it, for example, wind has always been obviously more mature technology than solar. So what does that mean? It means that China's solar industry really began on the backs of European tariffs, meaning building in China to export to Europe, right? Germany, Spain, not to consume in China because of the technology wasn't there. That drove down costs, and then only later was it consumed and produced within China for the Chinese market. That was very different than wind, rather, because wind was more mature, better economics, which is why you see really from the beginning, solar was made for China and also for increasingly for export. So there's that intolerance, I think, on the technology side, which by the way, we also see in nuclear, which is a different discussion.
And we see globally. Yeah, we could.
That's the other reason.
I'm going to take 10 seconds on CCS and read a Bloomberg Green headline from this year. China's largest carbon capture project is a global minnow. It's 0.15 million tons.
There you go. So yeah, we're not seeing it. But once it's a goal, you need 20% of that solution to be somehow, sequestered. So that's on a big question mark. How's that going to happen?
That's right. And for the CCUS fans, go back to last season when we had Sally Benson on the show. Okay. So last thing,
Minnow got a central role in the Obama OSTP, running the energy section.
Yeah. There you go. An energy versus climate alumni now.
Exactly. Yeah.
30 seconds or less. What does the experience of coal globally and its recent resurgence tell us about the future for other fossil fuel resources? 30 seconds.
Sara?
Well, I'm going to go with the resurgence, but also decline. And particularly in the US, it tells us that we really need to prepare for a just transition, and we need to be thinking about the liabilities up front, because we see the result of a not just transition away from coal in former coal mining regions. And we see the government in the US starting to acquire all of these liabilities, both environmental, but also pension as well, for miners that have worked with these companies for a long time. So we need to start planning for that now with oil as well.
Great. Let's go with David. I'll go, and then we'll get the last word to Edward.
It's a hard one. I think this is a lesson that cutting emissions is harder than we often think. It's totally possible. There's no question we can cut emissions, but that for cutting emissions, we have to focus on these big trends behind the scenes, and sometimes do a little less focusing on the latest gee whiz technology. The emissions drivers are these big, heavy pieces of industrial infrastructure, and we have to keep our eye on the ball because we have to make coal go away and quickly if we want to solve the climate problem.
So I'm going to quote the great Václav Smil when he said, energy forecasts are not worth even the cost of the cheapest acid paper on which they're printed, because coal is the latest, greatest example of a drastic turn compared to our forecasts a year ago. When prices crashed during the pandemic, we all happily wrote coal's obituary. It's premature. And I think with oil and gas prices high, oil now at $80 and gas way up too, it's premature to write their obituary as well. Edward, last word.
Yeah, I would just add that, I think I'm in agreement. And when I think there's a great group in Hong Kong called China Water Risk with former bankers, and they do a great job to basically show the world, look, whether it's your Vanguard retirement account or your pension, or rather your equity investments are not retirement, but for whatever it is you plan in the future, look at how much of that is sitting in Chinese funds, effectively, and Chinese companies. And when you do that, and you actually look at, forget about climate, just the water risk alone, right? So China has very, very little water. So the even water risk, let alone the coal and the climate risk, should dramatically reduce, right, the value of those underlying assets, given the very clear financial risk that they show, that they present. And so I guess for me, the biggest, I'm sort of pushing the biggest important shift has to be making that case very clearly, the way that China Water Risk does, to people not only downstream who hold those assets, but a lot of the bankers and others who push those assets. And I think once we get that right, that will also help a lot on the financial side of where money goes.
Yeah, and you mentioned water. I think of Lester Brown's "Who Will Feed China" and just the water risk of food production. But that's a whole different topic, and Edward will have to have you back on to that one. So big thanks, Edward Cunningham. Wonderful to have you on the show. We're really grateful. Closing comments, folks. This episode will be available at energyversusclimate.com or on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you listen. Our next episode will be in a couple weeks. Make sure you're subscribed to find out the topic and our guest. Give us feedback at energyversusclimate@gmail.com. Support us at energyversusclimate.com. Thank you to our new cadre of donors who are grateful for the support. And thanks to our very patient producer, Eva Voinigescu. And of course, as always, to Mika McFarlane for his superb webinar support. We'll see you in a couple weeks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.